race in a post-colonial sense. At the end of his life, then Du Bois had written more than 20 books, even several autobiographies, and interestingly enough, obviously many newspaper journal articles, but also novels. So he used the genre of novels also to diffuse his ideas. Du Bois was an internationally renowned figure who had traveled probably all countries in the world and was basically a friend and a visitor of many presidents at the time. So yeah, a very colorful figure, not comparable to these European scholars we have dealt with so far. So much about his life and works. Let's now turn a little bit to the main motivation of his work. So Du Bois knew, obviously, let's say, socialism and Marxism of his time, and one of the main problems he had was the, let's say, determinist aspect in Marx's work. So as a trained historian, Du Bois looked at the Black Reconstruction after the Civil War and noticed simply that this was driven by a lot of, let's say, civic activism. Yeah, so the role of human agency was much too underrated in the more deterministic account of Marx, according to Du Bois. Du Bois did not use the term racial capitalism that is associated with Robinson later, but he already made similar points in that, let's say, the problem of class is not just about economic class, but it is about a racial stratification also within the working classes, and the success of capitalists to divide the working classes along racial and ethnic lines. And this is a theme that hardly occurs in Marx's writings, but has also been known as an empirical phenomenon that is to split also the union movement in the United States across ethnic and racial lines, and hence made, let's say, the struggle of the working classes in the United States a much different one when compared to the European ones. So these are the, I would say, main problems that Du Bois had with a pure Marxian kind of theory. Lack of human agency and sort of a neglect of the racial dimension in class war. Weber was actually in a conversation with Du Bois. Not only had they met when in Berlin, Max Weber had traveled then to the United States in 1904, and which is when they met again, and they had a lifelong correspondence. And Alden Morris here even makes the point that it was more Du Bois who influenced Max Weber than the other way around. So both of them shared actually a common background of studying in the current of the German historical school. So they both considered sociology also as the study of historically situated phenomena, and they both also had actually a similar thesis, because they had written about agrarian conditions in various societies. Weber had written about the agrarian conditions of ancient civilizations in the 1890s, and Du Bois wrote rather than on the American 19th century and trading patterns. So it's interesting to note that according to Morris, at least Du Bois influenced Weber in that he shifted Weber's view on race from, let's say, one of biologically determinism to a much more social constructivist view. We'll see what this means exactly in a second. But Du Bois also had this influence on Weber. They both disagreed a little bit on the concept of the social sciences as value neutral science. So you know this to be Weber's position. Du Bois defended a moral realism. So a moral realist thinks that the world consists of moral facts that can also be objectively be studied. This is also a stance that Emil Durkheim proposes. And when the world is already, let's say, containing these normative facts, then it is difficult, obviously, to defend a social science that is completely value neutral. So here's a disagreement between the scholars. So one of the main opponents of Du Bois' writing are evolutionist thinkers, so Spencer, but also his followers in the United States. And the main problem, again, that Du Bois had with this line of thought is the then biological determinism that goes along with these evolutionary approaches, and the strong stance in favor of what one may call nomological holism, so this idea that the social world is governed also by a set of laws. And here again, Du Bois sees the importance of human agency in changing history underrated. Another cleavage line between Du Bois and these evolutionary thinkers is the understanding of race and also the stance to eugenics as a consequence. So evolutionary thinkers had a strong biological determinism of race, in that they thought race is determined by, in a way, the biological setup, the DNA structure, something that Du Bois then also criticized. This is also, I think, the bottom line of the conversation of Du Bois with the previous thinkers, that he reproaches them that they ignored something that he introduced as the color line. So the importance of racial differences, of racial discrimination within the United States, but also in a colonial and post-colonial sense. Yeah. And to quote him here from the Souls, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. Unquote. So to illustrate a little bit the importance of Du Bois' point, and not only when he wrote here historically ever since the 1890s, but even to the current day, I wanted to present a couple of long-run statistical patterns which show the importance of the color line. So here, in a very obvious urban sociology sense, segregation. Yeah. Segregation is often measured by urban sociologists by the dissimilarity, or so-called segregation index, which you see displayed here, and which ranges here from 0 to 1. Sometimes you also see it as ranging from 1 to 100. And the dissimilarity index measures how a minority and a majority population is distributed across all of the neighborhoods of a given city. If the entire minority population, let's say the African American population, lives in only one neighborhood, this index reaches 1 or 100. if the percentage of African Americans across all of the neighborhoods is the same, then the index scores 0. The minority-majority population can be defined in various ways. So it can be defined on, let's say, racial differences, African Americans versus others, Hispanics versus others. But you can also define it in economic terms, so all of the unemployed versus the non-unemployed, and so on. You can also interpret this index as a percentage number, such that, for instance, a 0.5 can be translated as 50% of the population would need to move across neighborhood boundaries in a given city to bring the index down to 0, to basically balance the populations across all neighborhoods in a city again. So these urban economists here actually produced long-run statistics of the most important American cities in this very long run. So this is then the index of racial segregation. And as you can see here, Du Bois was writing at a time when there was already a relatively high level, obviously, of segregation. But over his lifetime, this was to reach then almost then here 80%. So that so basically 80% of African Americans in here 1960 would have had to move in order to balance the distribution of populations across the major American cities. Now, this declined again in the latter years, but just to give you a point of reference here, when you compute indices of ethnic segregation, different ethnic groups in European cities, this hardly reaches the number of 0.3. Yeah? So, and it's rather going down in German cities over the last 2 decades, and is as low as 0.2. So segregation in American cities is in a categorically different